Hello, welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings. I am joined, as always, with my co-host, Jason Ounpraseuth. Jason, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We have a very special episode, and I won't middle down with random tangents. We'll just go straight ahead to our special guest
Yes,
today.
no discussion of the weather or Jason's fantasy basketball exploits, or his daily basketball exploits. We're here today with Dave Coletti. Dave, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm going to go on a limb and say that absolutely nobody listening to this podcast knows who Dave Coletti is, and that is solely by design. And so what we're doing today is I wanted to reach out to a casual wrestling fan or a lapsed wrestling fan or someone who doesn't watch all the time or however people want to talk about it. This is something that I kind of got the idea from over the last few weeks. There's been a lot of discussion about how does wrestling attract casual fans? How do you get people who maybe have a passing interest in the industry or maybe watched a long time ago to become active in today's wrestling environment? How do you get that person who maybe follows someone on Twitter or watches a YouTube video now and then? How do you get that person to spend money? What interests that person? And despite the fact that everyone loves to speak on behalf of the casual wrestling fans and likes to say, the casual wrestling fans love this, we don't actually hear from the casual wrestling fans all that much because by their nature, they're casual wrestling fans and they're probably not on Twitter or YouTube or Reddit or anywhere else commentating on what their specific views are. And so Dave here, who I do not know really and have never met in person, and this is the first time we've ever actually exchanged messages that weren't text-based. I know Dave from a message board site that is not a wrestling message board site. It's kind of a general sports message board site that we talk sometimes about wrestling on. And we've had some interactions over the years, and Dave has been open about his own fandom and how he will occasionally tune in and watch something. And so it got my attention to say, let me reach out to Dave and let me see if he actually wants to come on to our show and just talk about his fandom and talk about what he's interested in and kind of what he thinks about WWE now and what does he think of AEW and what does he see? Because it's really a viewpoint that's not represented in wrestling at all. And in a lot of ways is the most critical viewpoint of all because of the belief that casual or lapsed wrestling fans are this large monolithic block that if you were to convert them or appeal to them in a way that they become regular fans, your business will become phenomenally successful because there are theoretically millions of them. I don't think that's quite true, but I wanted to give Dave this opportunity and for us to all, both me and Jason and anyone else who's listening to this, who probably is in tune to the wrestling business, to really understand kind of what it's like to talk to a casual fan and see what they have to say about the industry. So I guess I'll start with this, Dave. Can you just describe your wrestling fandom kind of in general, like when you first became a wrestling fan and kind of when you think your fandom peaked?
Yeah. Well, again, thanks so much for having me on. This is really exciting. So I'm a middle-aged guy. So I grew up, I'm a kid of the 1980s. So I grew up watching wrestling in what I think has come to be known as like the golden era. It was the Hulk Hogan era, the Ric Flair era. And I actually vividly remember the first time I watched pro wrestling and how that like immediately propelled me into being a fan. I was 9 years old, which I think is a fairly common age when a lot of kids come to wrestling. And I'd heard of wrestling, but I'd never seen it. And I'm sure it was some Saturday morning as I was flipping around TV channels back when people did such a thing, flipped around TV channels, and I came across wrestling, and I remember the match, and it's kind of crazy to think about in retrospect. It was a match of old WWF of the Samoans, Alpha and Sika, who I think have gone on to be more famous as being fathers of much more famous wrestlers, and the Strongbows. And I was thinking, man, what a offensive, inappropriate matchup given the times that we're in today. But I was like transfixed. I thought this was like the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I'd always kind of heard the like, is wrestling real or not? And it took me like all of 30 seconds to be like, well, no, they're not hitting each other. That these guys are like 300 pounds. That's obvious. But I thought it was amazing. So I got into it right away. Like I was immediately hooked. I watched the rest of the show and I became a big fan. And I was thinking about this recently. I was growing up in a really, both the right era and like the right geographic location. Because I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm actually from Foxborough, Mass. So famous for other things in the sports world. But Foxborough is like equidistant between Boston and Providence. So back in the day, I got all the Boston TV stations and all the Providence TV stations. So I was able to watch, from 9, 10 years old. I remember, like, this is my Saturday. It was Superstars of Wrestling was the old WWF like flagship syndicated show, was on at 10 a.m. And at the exact same time, and I have no idea why, there was on another Boston station, they ran, which I think was then, it was WCCW. It was Texas wrestling. It was the Von Erichs wrestling.
World-class championship wrestling.
Yeah, world-class championship wrestling, right? So I would flip back and forth. So I'd watch all the WWF stuff. I'd watch the Von Erichs and the Freebirds and Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez and all those guys. And then we had cable, which was like a newish thing back then. And I was able to then Saturday night watch WTBS, which broadcast 2 hours of, it was like Georgia Championship Wrestling. I knew it as NWA, and I think that was Jim Crockett back then. So it was Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and all that. And then finally, because I had cable, back then in like weekday afternoons, ESPN would actually run like AWA hour-long broadcasts, and they were like almost like greatest hit shows, I guess. And it was really irregular, but I got to watch, who was on like Nick Bockwinkel and Larry Zbyszko, and I think the Road Warriors started there. Anyway, So like I grew up watching all these promotions, and I got way into it, and I would go, it's pre-internet, so it's different than today, and there's no Twitter, and there's, but I would go to like the convenience store and I'd buy Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, which I think was, it was still like kayfabe back then, right? So,
back then, it still is today.
That's wild. That's pretty crazy to think that can still exist. But it was also like 2 months or more behind the times, I guess, because of the publishing schedule, which again seems impossible now. But like, so I could read up on what was happening in other promotions around the country, around North America, right? So I was about as well versed as a 10-year-old as I think you could be, as far as what wrestling was, and that's what I just loved it. I just thought it was theatrical and athletic, and I was just totally hooked. And so that's not where it all came from. And I kind of like dived in the deep end from like day one, and was like super immersed in it as a kid.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you say that. Like you mentioned how like the first like couple seconds of that Samoans and Strongbows match, you like immediately understood like, okay, this is clearly fake. This is all like performance arts. Like, but is that what sort of brought you into wrestling, just like the athleticism and the theatrics of it, even though you understood that like, okay, this is all like sort of, they're not actually hitting each other. It's not like a shoot, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. Because I was just like, and it immediately struck me as, so they're doing a thing, right? This is planned somehow. I mean, I didn't know the mechanics of it, obviously, right. But like, but it's funny because immediately I realized, even at a young age, like that was like still the debate back then. I mean, this was still a few years, I think, before it just, everyone acknowledged like, sure, this is scripted, right? Like there was still mystery to it. And I just remember thinking, well, who cares? Like, yeah, obviously they're not hitting each other, but from then to this day, like, I mean, movies are fake, TV shows are fake. No one is like, oh, I don't like Marvel because, they're not actually superheroes, right? Like, I thought that was like a silly way of looking at it. And it was just incredibly entertaining, and the characters were really rich, and the storylines were cool to at least, the 10-year-old me. So yeah, I just thought it was just like a really amazing thing to follow, and I think when I started following it, I feel like I got in a really cool time, because it was like just ahead of that like 80s explosion. Like when I started watching WWF, Bob Backlund was still champion, although I think Hogan came in and became champion very shortly after. I mean, not too long after I started watching it. So I got to watch like all of that. Like I got to watch them go on MTV, and I remember the first WrestleMania because that's how old I am, and and everything like that. But that's when everything just skyrocketed. So I kind of got in on the ground floor. I kind of felt like I made it in just early enough, like the very last stage where I could say like, oh, like, I was here before it was cool. And then it really just exploded in the 80s. And then I was just like so into it because it became really mainstream and really accessible.
And this is really good to hear because your experience is so similar to millions and millions of other people who grew up watching wrestling during that time period. It really is like, I think kind of what you just described, how your fandom came to be. I have talked to many people that have experienced it the same way, people who probably aren't fans anymore, who say, yeah, I was a kid in the 80s with, the Hulk Hogan era and the Hulkamania era, and it was just this great time to be a wrestling fan. And you can see with the WWF in particular, how their business exploded over the course of the 1980s. They obviously were creating a lot of new fans. And if you went to the shows, there were a lot of kids in the crowd. When would you say you started kind of falling out and losing, the kind of passion, going to the newsstand every week and getting the PWI magazines and watching, like 6 different promotions per week? When would you say you kind of lost that kind of passion and interest?
Yeah, it was early 90s. And it's funny, just like I have this vivid memory of when like the match I saw that got me into it, I also have a vivid recollection of, I guess it was like a promo package that started to get me out of it. I mean, I think, most people, through anything you follow, you kind of, it waxes and wanes. And, I mean, anything that you're into, it kind of takes that arc throughout your life. But in this case, I remember, I guess it was 90, 91, maybe like 91, I think. So I'd been into it for like 8 years, let's say, like way into it. And I remember I was watching WWF, one of their Saturday shows, and they started doing these packages with Tito Santana. And Tito Santana had gone away, and he of course was a huge star for like the 70s and 80s and held championships and all that. And they reintroduced him as El Matador. And I was like, and it was right after, now that I remember, it was right after they had brought Ricky Steamboat back. And when Ricky Steamboat came back, he wasn't Ricky Steamboat anymore, he was the Dragon. And I'm like, okay, like this is just getting ridiculous, because all along I knew that WWF, they had this big thing where like nothing exists outside WWF, and every new person they'd bring in from NWA or AWA, they would never reference who they were. Okay, like it's kind of silly, but I get it, right? They want to create their own world. But when you bring people in, like one of them who was like Tito Santana, who was like, a year prior, like Intercontinental Champion or something like that, and you're basically telling your fans, forget it. He's not that guy anymore. Forget that you ever knew him. He's not him. He's El Matador. I'm like, this is a bit much. Like I just found that era that they were moving into, where everything is like every guy is a new guy, and he has no history, and we're just gonna make up a name for him, and it's not like a human name, it's just like some character. I was just like, I think it's running its course with me, And then it also, in terms of timing, that was right when I was 17 or so, and I was heading off to college. And when I went off to college, like everything took a backseat to that. Like it wasn't just wrestling; it was everything. Like I'm a huge lifelong sports fan. I don't think it's been 4 years in my life where I paid less attention to like sports day to day than when I went off to college, because it was just other things. And there wasn't an internet that made following stuff easy. You had to really work for it. So that kind of triggered it. I just was kind of getting bored with the product. I went away, and then I just never picked it back up. And it was one of those things where I was always aware of things that were going on in wrestling. Like as the 90s went along, I knew about like Ted Turner turning WCW into a big thing, and they poached a lot of the old WWF guys. Like I knew that was going on. I just wasn't watching, and I think that happened all the way through. So I basically checked out from watching anything for like 25 years. Like, I mean, again, I knew who Stone Cold was. I knew who The Rock was. I'm sure I saw a clip here and there, or, you know, when YouTube became a thing, I'm sure I saw some stuff, but I wasn't watching. I never watched Raw. I never watched Nitro or anything like that. I was totally out of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So like basically the whole like and the NWO angle and WCW, like that wasn't a big enough sort of thing to bring it back in. Even like a Stone Cold as well. The WWF doesn't sound like those were big enough to really bring it back in.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, you would think they would have, but I think maybe I was just, again, it's a different time in my life, right? And you're in your 20s and things are going on, and I just, because I had checked out, it made it. It was like it would have been an effort to get back into it. And I probably had a lot of half-baked assumptions about what was going on, right? Like, I'm sure if I was watching, I might have known better, but I think I thought it was cool that I thought the NWO concept was cool. I thought it was cool that Hogan finally became a bad guy. Like, he probably should have done that years before. But it also struck me that like that promotion was like, hey, here's all your old WWF guys that you watched in the late 80s, and they're back. And I was like, okay, I watched these guys before. I don't need to watch this again. Like, I don't need to see Randy Savage 6 years later. Like, I know what that whole thing is about. And with the WWF, I'll be honest. And again, I think this is a big part of like the lore of the time, and maybe I was off on this, but it also struck me that they, like, a lot of what they were doing in that like Attitude Era, Stone Cold era, was, kind of the rated R type stuff. And I, in particular, like, not that any of that offends me. I'm not like that necessarily. Because at the same time I was hearing about that, I was watching like The Sopranos, so it wasn't like I was like aghast at like violence or swearing or anything like that. But like, I also saw, or maybe heard secondhand, a lot of like the like objectification of women type stuff, which it just turned me off. I was like, I don't need that from like wrestling, like, I mean, that's always been there a bit. There was always valets and, that kind of thing. But I just saw some of that stuff going on, and I'm like, yeah, this ain't for me. Like, I'm sure I'd love it if I was 14, but like I'm 24 now, and I don't know, it feels kind of, to get back into it for that felt a little weird. So yeah, I was just kind of out on the thing. Yeah.
And so, but it's interesting. Over the time, you have kept a passing interest enough in wrestling, even though you hadn't really followed it for decades and decades, to still kind of pay attention roughly to what was going on.
Yeah.
Did you ever sit down and watch a show, like a full show time to time, or did you ever purchase a pay-per-view, or you went over to a friend's house and it was on?
Nothing like that. I think if I'm trying to think back through it, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm almost positive the last time I like really watched something was one of the last WrestleManias. So like I said, like 91-ish. Like, it was probably like the WrestleMania, what an awful WrestleMania, of when Hulk Hogan wrestled Sergeant Slaughter, and it was like during the Iraq War. I'm pretty sure, and from that on out, I remember in college, some of my buddies would get WrestleMania, and I'd watch like a match or two. So I may have caught like a little bit here and there of like whatever, like WrestleMania 8, 9, 10. But from there on out, nothing. I mean, Monday nights, I was watching Monday Night Football, not Monday Night Raw, and I don't think I ever stumbled across much of anything. I'm sure I may have for 5 minutes, peeked at something if it was whatever network it was on back then when you're flipping channels. But no, I was not seeking it out. I never watched anything end to end. No pay-per-views, no nothing.
So one of the things that really interests me, kind of going back and thinking about this, and we'll touch on the modern product in a minute, but so you watch wrestling in the 80s as a kid. I'm going to assume that when you were a kid in the 80s, were your classmates into wrestling? Do you have friends that were into wrestling? Was it something you were only interested in, or was it kind of a general social thing that
yeah, no, it was again, it got really mainstream. I mean, so amongst my friends, the boys, not the girls, but the boys, definitely, I just remember following wrestling like any other sport, basically. Mm-hmm. Like, we would talk about, like, this sounds crazy, right? I had a friend of mine who created a March Madness style pool, like bracket for WrestleMania 4 when they had the tournament to like crown a new champion. And like dozens of kids in my grade like threw in like $5 and participated in that. Like, it was people were fans of Hogan and Savage and Andre and that, the British Bulldogs and all that crew, the exact same way that we were fans of Roger Clemens or Bo Jackson or Wayne Gretzky. I mean, they were peers to like kids like me. It was conversational. You would talk about it as if it were any other sport, which is, I don't know if that was unique or what, but yeah, I'm amongst my friends, it was mainstream and yeah, very popular.
So what feels like a contrast to that is, I think of someone like yourself, and you're into wrestling as a kid, even if you weren't watching wrestling throughout the 90s or the 2000s, because you had this experience as a kid, there was always a level of affinity for it in a way that you wouldn't have had for something that you had never had any interest in it. And so there's always the possibility that you could be reeled back into something, that you could become interested once again, even if you had kind of in your life moved past like, oh, I don't really watch wrestling anymore. I used to, but I don't. When I was a kid, and I'm assuming Jason has the same experience because we're almost the same age, in the mid 2000s, especially when I was in high school, nobody watched wrestling. Like I had one friend in high school who watched wrestling, and we still like, he's like my one I go to shows with and stuff like that. That's how we still stay in touch, is through wrestling. But no, and you certainly wouldn't talk about it in public with other people. It was this stigma. And it wasn't really until I got into my 20s, and one day I had wrestling on, and one of my roommates came in and he was like, oh, is this pro wrestling? And I'm like, yeah, I love pro wrestling. And he's like, oh, like, isn't it fake? Like, he just had no idea what it was. He didn't know if it was real. He didn't know it was fake. He didn't know like you need to get like a 3 count to pin somebody. He just had completely no idea what pro wrestling is. And I feel like that's something I think a lot of older fans might take for granted, was just how ubiquitous wrestling was when they were children compared to subsequent generations that are now approaching, their late 20s and early 30s. And I do think that makes a big difference on like the casual fan aspect of those people, like my roommate who has never heard of professional wrestling in his life in his mid 20s. He's not gonna, he doesn't have the same kind of like affinity for it. And he's not going to be the person that can potentially be reeled back in. You almost have to start completely from scratch with a new generation of children. I don't know. I think
that's fascinating. And I'm old enough where I was not aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because like literally like I'm sure you guys have, like I have a years running text chain with a bunch of buddies of mine that I went to college with, and we're all the same age. And it was just a month ago maybe, where one of my pals sent a text around because it was the 35th anniversary of WrestleMania 3, right? And we were joking how like in 1987 for us, Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3 was every bit like the iconic sports moment that any World Series, any Super Bowl, like any cultural moment of the 80s, like Hogan Andre WrestleMania 3 is like, it's right on par, totally on par. And I think you'd find a lot of people my age who would tell you, of course I knew, I either watched it or I was very aware of what was going on. So it's interesting to hear that like in subsequent years, like it kind of slid back underground. Because it was just so pervasive. But it also makes me think, and I know this is kind of like what we're talking about, like I wonder if opportunities are being wasted because you got people like me and my friends, and probably to some degree younger than me, maybe who grew up, let's say at that same age through the Attitude Era, who a lot of us have become parents, we have kids. I think, if there's an opportunity, like any dad would love to see his kids like kind of get interested in the things that like you're interested in when you were a kid, right? But that window is short, right? That window of maybe like the mid to late 80s to 2000 or whenever it began to kind of fall back out of favor again. You get that window of a decade or so where people like me have kids, could introduce them or get pulled back in through them. But if that window closes, then then you're kind of striking out, and then you have to create adult fans which I think is really, really difficult. Like, I don't know how you do that. I feel like wrestling is one of those things that if you don't come to it as a kid, I just don't know how that happens. You know, how you convert someone with, particularly now when, you know, it was different for me in the 80s. We didn't have a lot of choices. Like, I mean, there was just only so many things to get into. But now you have everything. You have like 6 decades of pop culture at your fingertips at all times, you know, between Netflix and Spotify and everything else, right? So it's like, I don't know how you'd attract someone today in their 20s who've never been into it before, unless they have a friend who kind of drags them along to stuff, you know. But otherwise, I think it's a moment where there could be an opportunity for these promotions, and I don't know if there's season on it. You know, that's like, I'm sure that's why we're talking, right? So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you mentioned you talk about how like, oh, everyone knows like Marvel's fake. Like I remember growing up as a kid, you know, if you're into comic books or superheroes, you were the nerd, like in a bad way. Yeah, like in the worst way possible. But nowadays, you know, everyone's into it, and it's the most popular franchise in the world. But like you said, like wrestling is a different category towards that, because like movies are definitely more accessible to people of all ages than compared to wrestling, where you know, especially WWE, they're an interesting case where they sort of cater to children, but many of their key audience is a lot older, and so they're in a weird place where, you know, they're trying to cater to different audiences, but at the same time they're mostly not catering to most people in anyways. And you mentioned before how, you know, you were watching WCW in the 90s because like, oh, Brady Savage is back, like I already saw him before. And ironically, WWE is in that similar place where like, oh, Edge is back, like I already saw him 10 years ago, so like I don't need to see him again. Or Brock Lesnar's the champion, or at least he was, but like Brock Lesnar's been around for, you know, the past couple of years, like I don't really need to see more of him anymore.
Yep, for sure. And I get the clinging to nostalgia, and I'm sure it's a money, I know it's a money maker for them, right? I mean, you bring these guys back, you have the Undertaker wrestle until he's like literally dead, which is kind of ironic, but it's like, but because of that, I mean, there's only so many pops you can get, right? There's only so much nostalgia you can wallow in before it just like, it's not really exciting to anyone anymore, you know, and it just kind of burns itself out. And I do think that that's probably a challenge particularly for, you know, for WWE now, is that I mean, where can you take that? And it's not good for like the long-term health of any business to be reliant on guys that have basically retired 20 years ago. You know, I mean, again, as a one-off, it's fine, but it's not sustainable. You know, it's not like Major League Baseball is bringing Ken Griffey Jr. back for a home run derby like that. I mean, that's kind of preposterous, right? Like you wouldn't do it, or if you did, it would be like a really cool novelty, but you wouldn't bring like, you know, the next 15 players back every year. Like that would make no sense. But that's kind of what I think WWE does a lot now, which is, again, probably not, it's short-term revenue pops, and I'm sure all these businesses are living quarter to quarter because it's a public company, but like you're not really building anything for the future that way, it would seem, you know.
Right. As a general rule, it's reference when it comes to nostalgia in wrestling is that nostalgia can draw big at first, but it has a very short shelf life.
Yeah.
And with WWE, we're kind of seeing them go through the motions as far as, okay, like we're going to use the Undertaker, and then the Undertaker kind of gets too old. And they've been relying for so long on nostalgic acts for big events that they are now having to use people who were never really that big of stars as nostalgia acts. I think Edge is a good example in the sense that Edge is really popular to wrestling fans who still watch WWE, and that's why if he comes out, he gets giant reactions. But Edge has never been able to bring viewers back to Monday Night Raw or SmackDown or sell more tickets. He hasn't really made it. He hasn't connected with the casual or lapsed fan, and that's largely because Edge is not as big of a star as Randy Savage was, and he wasn't as big of a star as The Undertaker was. But because they've spent so long relying on nostalgia acts for key roles or part-time performers in key roles, Edge is now remains a bigger star than the generation younger than him, because those younger generations never had a chance to really establish themselves. And like it's like, yeah, he's like, okay, Ken Griffey Jr. comes back for a home run derby, and like, actually that sounds kind of cool. It's like if they did that every year, and then you're going through the motions, and suddenly it's not Ken Griffey Jr., it's Rafael Palmeiro, and then it's Brett Boone, and it gets like more reduced as far as like, who can we bring back to get a big pop? And of course, like at the Royal Rumble and things like that, anyone can come out and get a big pop if they're from the past. Like it can be the Boogeyman, or it can be the Godfather. It can be anybody who like actually wasn't that popular in their time, but because nostalgia has people remember them from when they were younger and a more innocent time, they get more into it. But it's one of those things. So I wanted to ask, you told me that you purchased AEW Revolution.
Yeah.
Can you tell me kind of why you purchased that? You said it was your first pay-per-view wrestling event you bought in a long time, and you kind of just got done telling us like, yeah, I never watched the full show, like I never kind of got back into it. What all of a sudden, 30 years later, what made you want to buy a pay-per-view for and what was so appealing about that?
So here's how I did get back into it a few years ago, briefly. So, and I just we may have traded notes about this at one point. So my son, coincidentally, when he was 9, started to get interested in wrestling. And it kind of came out of the blue. I don't know what triggered it. So I was like, oh, great. Like I said, like, yeah, like that was when I got into it. Great. Let's watch YouTube. Let's I probably overdid it. Right. So, but he got into it. We started watching WWE because that was the only thing. That was the only game in town, as far as I knew at that point, right? Like 5 years ago. So, and we went all in for like a year or two. So he got into it. We started watching it. I took him. I live in Connecticut now. I took him to a Raw airing up in Hartford, which we had fun. But my God, what an excruciating live experience when you're there with like a 9-year-old. Like, and he had a blast, but like, I mean, people talk about how it's hard to watch a 3-hour wrestling show like on your couch. Going to a Raw, it was like a 5-hour experience, and there's so much dead time. But I mean, we had a good time. But like, we went to that. I live in Fairfield County, Connecticut, so I live right near Bridgeport. And so we went to a couple of house shows at the Bridgeport Arena. We were watching, not the whole episode, but a lot of Raw and SmackDown, that kind of thing. And then I got WWE Network when there was like the distinct streaming network before it got folded into Peacock. So yeah, for like, I don't know, a year and a half or two, maybe, I was back into it, and I really enjoyed it. I loved the house shows. The house shows to me were like the best part of the experience. It was a lot of fun. But what's crazy is that my son got burned out on it really quick. Like, he was all in. He had his favorite wrestlers. He made signs when we went to Raw, like the whole deal. And by the end of it, he was like 11, and he got disgusted with it. And like there was a couple of pay-per-views with, I guess, what I've come to learn is like an infamous WWE booking. And I remember one, we'd watched I don't know which one it was. We watched I think it was a SummerSlam between Lesnar and Randy Orton, and that was the one where Lesnar like opened him up, like he went MMA on him and elbowed him, and he's bleeding. And my son's little. I gotta let him stay up late for it, and he was so pissed. He was so mad because he was just like, "What is this? Like, I stayed up, and I got this. I got like 2 minutes, and there's blood all over the place. They didn't even have a match. Like, so he was out. Like, he was out. So I went back into seclusion. I wasn't watching wrestling anymore because he wasn't watching it. But I'd heard about AEW. Yeah, yes, please.
I want to pause for a quick second.
Okay.
If you were to give me the time frame of like when your kid was a fan, and you were to make me guess, like what happened in WWE that turned him off from being a fan, I would not have guessed the Brock Lesnar Randy Orton match. I would have thought of like 100, right, Jason? Like I would have thought of 100 other things other than that.
Exactly.
I think it was building. I think there was other things. He would just get disappointed in the way stuff would roll, like the booking decisions and all that. Like, and
did he like the baby? Did he like the baby faces, or did he like heels?
He gravitated towards both. What I realized was that I think a big difference was when I was his age following it, like I mentioned, because there was no internet, because there was a lot less product. It was like like WWF was like an hour or two a week. I mean, it wasn't much. There was, you weren't reading stuff. There wasn't reviews. There was only 3 or 4 pay-per-views a year. Like there was scarcity, so you really look forward to it. I remember when they would run Saturday Night's Main Event, when it would preempt Saturday Night Live, and that was like the coolest thing when that was like on regular like NBC. For him, he could immerse himself in it, which in a way is good, but it also meant he was immediately exposed to every cynical person on YouTube and who was like doing reviews and this sucks and whatever. And I think that got to him because I would hear his point of view on things, and I could tell that he was like parroting some of that, like, these are adults who are tired of the product. And so I think he started looking a lot more critically at it than I ever did. So I think everything on 1 to 99 of that list, like I'm sure he was exposed to someone's aggravation with that, and it all boiled over at that SummerSlam where he finally, I guess, had enough and checked out of it. So yeah, it's kind of funny how that worked out. But so the funny thing was I enjoyed getting back into it with him. So I kind of kept an eye on it, even though we weren't watching it anymore. And I was really fascinated when I heard about AEW starting up. I just thought, oh, this is cool, like a whole new promotion. I remember when I was younger, and I thought that was like part of the most fun of wrestling in the 80s was that there were multiple promotions and they were competitive with each other and they were poaching each other's talent. You could follow, and there was different styles. Like it's kind of like it reminded me of like college football, where it's like, it's not like the NFL where everything's kind of the same. It's like people run different offenses and there's different, schedules. And I felt like wrestling used to be that way. And then when WWE killed them all and was triumphant, then it was like one thing, right? And that was it. So I thought, oh, this is cool. AEW is starting, and like they're starting on a major network with tons of money behind it. So it's kind of like they won't fail unless they want to fail, because this family could afford to fund this thing as a hobby forever, right? I mean, they're billionaires, right? So I was kind of keeping it. I wasn't really watching AEW. I would flip it on every once in a while for 10 minutes. I was reading stuff about it. I was watching YouTube videos about it. But I wasn't like way into it because I didn't know any of the wrestlers. Like I didn't follow the independent wrestling scene. So I didn't know who these people were, other than like Jericho, because I knew him from WWE. I guess Cody Rhodes, right? I knew him too. But then when they started I don't know, it felt like there was just more buzz growing, and they brought in CM Punk, and I thought that was really interesting. Even though it's funny, even though I didn't follow any CM Punk when he was like a star. Like I was out, but I knew of him, and I remember I did watch like the Pipe Bomb on YouTube, even though I was not watching wrestling, because I thought that was really cool that he like went off script. And I don't even know if that actually was off script, but it seemed like it was, right? I didn't know anything he was talking about, but I thought it was cool. But it was cool that they brought him in, and it was cool that they brought in Brian Daniel, whatever, the Daniel Bryanson, whatever he is. They keep flipping his name around, right? I thought that was really interesting that they were bringing these stars in, and I'd heard this pay-per-view was going to be like a big deal, and I don't know if, it was fine. It was entertaining. I read afterwards it maybe wasn't like the best that they've ever done, but I got my money's worth. I was entertained for 3 or 4 hours, so it was a good show, and I kind of like what they're doing in that promotion. It feels a little old school to me in a good way. It's familiar to me, the way that they seem to be approaching the wrestling. So yeah, so I don't know if I'd spend it again, because it's a lot of money to spend. It was like an impulse buy, and it was myself in my basement. If I had some friends over and we were splitting the cost, it would be, maybe I'd do it more often. But at this age, I don't have friends who are into wrestling, so it's maybe it's more familiar to you guys that way. So yeah.
No, we just got through telling you that we have no friends that watch wrestling. We're
Yeah,
we're
pretty
we're, we're in our 20s. We don't have no watches wrestling. No, I think it's really interesting you use the term familiar, because I think that a lot of the criticism AEW gets, and a lot of it I think is bad faith criticism in this part, is that it's too confusing for casual fans. It's full of inside references, and if you didn't know all of these things, you wouldn't like it. And to me, there's a lot of insecurities that come forth when people say that, because I think people consider a big thing with AEW was that people who maybe had podcasts or they ran websites or they were journalists covering wrestling, they fancied themselves wrestling experts and I know everything about wrestling and I'm the wrestling guy, when realistically they were the WWE guy and they weren't following wrestling outside of WWE. And you could get away with that and have a major platform before AEW existed, because ultimately what really drove any form of like business towards your website or towards your podcast was going to be WWE coverage and WWE analysis. And when AEW came up and kind of changed the game and it kind of exposed these people for not knowing as much as they thought they knew about the professional wrestling industry, they tend to lash out. And then they bring up the casual fan argument, which is, if I am confused by this, then the casual fan is definitely confused by this. And I brought up a specific example, and I talked to you about this, was CM Punk coming out to Mizira. Was it Jason? You're the pop punk expert. Is it Mizira Cantera?
Is it Pantera?
No,
was that
AFI? The AFI song.
Oh yeah.
Is Missouri? It's like Mizira Canteria. I don't know. It's in Latin. The point is, he came out to his old Ring of Honor theme song, and it didn't come out to Cult of Personality. And there was this big thing where people are like, the casuals are going to be so confused by, he didn't come out to his song, he came out this other song. It might be cool to like the 1% people who know, but everyone else. And it's like this whole thing, because it's social media and it's Twitter, and it turns into like this big, like days-long debate about what his music really meant. And I remember I asked you, I was like, were you confused by the music? And then, I mean, you told me that you kind of were able to understand it pretty quickly because
I mean, I was confused. I had no idea what was going on, but it's also, I guess it depends on how much. I guess if someone is thinking of this casual fan, and I will, I guess, wave the flag and represent all the casual fans out there. But like, I feel like if you're not just an idiot, like, I mean, if you have some intelligence, you could be like, all right, what I understood immediately was, I don't know what this is, but there was a number of people in the arena who thought it was really cool, right? So I just had a suspicion, well, this must be something he's done before, right? That he hasn't done in a while. Like, I don't know, that just seemed obvious. It was like, it's context clues, right? We learned this in like middle school English, right? So it was like, I didn't get it, but people seem to be enjoying it. So as a casual fan, I'm there for the fun. Like, so I was just like, all right, this must be cool. Great. Go with it. Like, I don't know. Like, I didn't really think that deeply about it. You know what I mean? But you know what, when you're talking about that, you know what it reminds me of is, I guess I'll keep referencing back to like Marvel or even like Star Wars. I think about this, like, I'm old enough where like I remember, I don't remember the original Star Wars. I'm not that old, but like I remember Return of the Jedi. That's like the same time I became a wrestling fan, right? So I was there for like Star Wars. I've never watched any of the expanded Star Wars universe. I've never watched the animated, like the Clone Wars stuff. I never watched that. I've heard it's great. I just never got around to watching it. So I know that like when they've brought back, like I have watched like The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. And I know from reading stuff online that there's all sorts of like Easter eggs and things that go on in those shows that are references, like really subtle references to like the whole expanded universe and the different, things. That's all lost on me, right? I think it's cool that they do it. I think fan service like that is awesome. They should put in those things for like really diehard fans. It doesn't detract from my enjoyment in any way. Like, so it's kind of like, I think that's good storytelling. Like, you should have layers. Like, Marvel operates that way, right? If you want to watch a Marvel movie, you can either take it as very superficial, superheroes blowing up stuff, like, the good guys win in the end, whatever, like, or there's subtext and there's things you can get into, and right, that's good storytelling. Like, so I kind of feel like someone who's saying that, to me anyway, as a casual fan, is like missing the point. Like, there should be that. There should be layers to it so that I can enjoy it in one way and you guys can enjoy it on another way, and that's precisely what entertainment is supposed to be. The worst thing you can do is dumb it down, because if you dumb it down so everything is so that I like get it, then you're gonna get upset, because and you can't ignore the target audience. I mean, I know that much about any business, right? You can't do that. So yeah, it's weird for me to hear people be critical of something like that. If anything, that should be a spark to get me to want to learn more, and that should make me potentially more avid, right? So when we had that conversation, Jesse, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I know nothing about Ring of Honor. I know nothing about like what CM Punk, I know nothing about CM Punk really, other than like very superficial stuff. That would lead me to go on YouTube and watch some stuff. And now I'm a tick more towards being an avid fan than I was a casual fan. That's what you should be doing. You should be dropping these little clues for me to go after and try to find this stuff. Otherwise, I'll never get more than casual, I would think, But I don't know, maybe I'm an outlier. Maybe I don't know. I have no idea.
No, it creates like if you're a prospective fan who maybe like you're buying pay-per-view for the first time, you've already shown that you're willing to spend money on it, which is really important.
Yeah.
Which is just saying, you said, I don't know if I'll buy it again, but presumably if AEW came out with something that was really interesting or a really big show, you might pull the trigger again. And to me, like you said, how it kind of makes you feel like you could become a bigger star. It kind of shows that there's like a reward to being more invested in it, which is like, I enjoy this at this kind of like surface level, but I also see people that are really into it and they're getting so much out of it. I want to be like that. Like when I first started watching, and Jason's the same way, we both watch the Premier League. And I first started watching the Premier League. I kind of like, I didn't really have a team. I kind of like watching, the games. And when, if a team would score a big goal and you just see the crowd going crazy, and I'd be like, I want to be as invested in this as those people are, because look at their excitement and look at this emotion that they're having. And that's what I want to be out of my fandom. And that was kind of like a reward for like, yeah, watch more games, get more into it, follow, pick a team, follow them, get really excited about it. And then like a few years later, the only time I have ever cried during a sporting event was when Tottenham Hotspur came back from 3 goals down to score and advance to the Champions League a couple of years ago. Like I literally had tears in my eyes as an adult. I definitely cried as a kid. I cried during Super Bowl 43. It was heartbreaking. But as an adult, that was the first time. And I was like, and that was the reward for like spending years getting into Tottenham and getting into soccer. And I feel like it can be said for anything, is like the kind of impulse to want to get to know more, and the reward it shows. It's probably not good for WWE that the hardcore fans are like so disappointed in the product. And like you said, it had impact on your son, who would like, have his opinion kind of warped by whether things would pop up on his YouTube algorithm or whatever. And all of a sudden he's espousing points that, he probably heard some blogger say about last night's Raw episode. It's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah. It's funny when we were talking earlier about like the older stars coming back, it reminded me, I'm almost positive that I was watching with him. I think we were when Goldberg came back. And again, like I was probably vaguely aware of Goldberg when he had his initial run, but it was largely lost on me. But I knew who he was. I knew he was a huge star and all that. So, and I just remember when he came back, and like the reaction was huge. The arena was just going crazy. But it was very obvious that like that burned out super fast. Like at least it felt that way. And I just remember a few months in, because they brought him back. It wasn't just like a one-time deal, right? They brought him back to like do a whole like program. And I felt like by the end of it, people were like, they weren't into it. Like it was just like enough already, And I feel like that's, part of it, like you were talking about there, was like, I think sometimes WWE, at least, and I'm no expert, but it just strikes me as like they just get a lot of stuff wrong. And it was like with that guy, it was like, cool, bring him back. People like it. Oh, an old timer. He's still in great shape. Great. Not for 6 months. Like, no. Like, he can't be like a central figure in storytelling. Like, his matches can't go more than like 4 minutes, which is no fault of his. Like, he's a ridiculously fit 50-something-year-old, but like, come on, like, you can't do this. And it felt like the crowd was just like, we get it. He's back. All right, moving on. Someone new. Like, enough of this. And I think, I think they struggle with that. And I think they probably struggle with a lot of just the negativity that surrounds the product, although they, but yet they draw 70,000 people for 2 nights to Dallas. last month. So it's not like all bad news for them, but I don't know. It's a conundrum, right?
Right, but I guess AEW, they've used their own run of nostalgia as well. Of course, Sting of course is a big part of AEW. You mentioned you know who Chris Jericho was, and of course Taz himself. He's not wrestling himself, but he has his own faction within himself. I mean, what's your impression of how AEW uses nostalgia with the amount you've watched so far?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So like, I don't know. I guess maybe it's still like the honeymoon period of just like a new promotion or what. It's not that new anymore, I guess, but like for me it is. um it just feels more organic, like it's more woven into the storylines a bit better, so it doesn't come across as like someone hammering you over the head with like, hey, it's nostalgia, remember 1999? Like, oh, it's like, I mean, Sting, I mean, geez, I cannot fathom that Sting. Like that pay-per-view that I watched, he like jumped off on the tables. Like that, the guy is in his 60s, right? Like, I mean, I remember Sting when he was a Blade Runner in like the mid 1980s, teaming with who would become the Ultimate Warrior. That's like no one that age should be wrestling. But yet, I don't know. It feels like right. They pair him with the right guys. It kind of feels like it's not like ridiculous that he's doing what he's doing. I don't know how to explain it. Again, it's just all storytelling. It fits he fits the part. Jericho still brings it, like, I don't know, like these guys feel like they're still relevant, even though I know they're ancient. So I don't know how to, it's strange, but it works for me.
I think with Jericho, he's still basically just a functional member of the roster. Like he wrestles pretty regularly. Like he doesn't have like only 5-minute matches. Sting is used more as like a special attraction. I think the big difference is that they're not used in a main event. I mean, Jericho not anymore really, but especially Sting, like not really used in a main event role, which I think is the frustrating part with WWE. And like, we're going to bring Goldberg back and we're going to put the world title on him and we're going to have him beat like these other people that you might like he's going to kill Kevin Owens. He's going to kill The Fiend. He's going to do these things. Like, we're going to push this guy like really hard and above a lot of our current talents because we're desperate and we need to get someone that fans are interested in, as opposed to Sting, which is like a nostalgia pop. There's like a novelty to it, even though he's obviously wrestled multiple matches. It doesn't feel necessarily like they're relying on this old guy to do something for them in maybe quite the same way that WWE is.
Totally captured. That totally captures, I think, the much better articulation of what I was trying to say. Yeah, absolutely. That's totally how I feel. The same way, like I remember I was still watching. I think I got WrestleMania when I had WWE Network, when they had Roman Reigns wrestle The Undertaker. I think it was when Roman Reigns beat him, right? That's how The Undertaker was supposed to retire and all that, right? Before they brought him back for those hideous Saudi Arabia shows. But like that match was awful. I mean, Undertaker couldn't move. Like that was like before he had like hip surgery and all that. And like, I mean, and yeah, it was like, wow, this guy like should not be in a main event or whatever, closing match. Like this is gruesome to watch, and it's and I think you're right. Like WWE does that where it's like, hey, this guy is back and he can beat up all the 28-year-olds that are like in the promotion. It's like, well, I just don't know who that's serving. It makes those guys look really pathetic. And yeah, you're not really building business that way. You're just kind of stringing it along from one event to the next. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, like you mentioned the Saudi Arabia shows, just like as a casual fan, like does WWE's or maybe to a lesser extent AEW's, does the ethical issues that maybe around the industry, like does that faze you at all as a fan, as potentially like, am I going to spend my money on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean,
not to put you on the spot and be like, dude, WWE does this.
It's a fair question. It's a fair question. I mean, ultimately, I guess it doesn't, because I still like, will watch it and enjoy it. I got back into it. Like, I mean, look, I know how awful the NFL is, and I'm as big an NFL fan as you're gonna find. So like, I'm willing to put my ethics aside for entertainment. Yeah, it's tough though. Like the Saudi Arabia thing is like on a whole nother level. Like I just cannot believe that they do that and take that money. And I wouldn't watch it. That's just awful. The other more like, I guess, like, systemic issues, and I don't know. See, I don't know about how AEW treats their performers. I don't know if they're considered actual employees with health benefits, or if it's like, they're contractors and whatever. That stuff does bother me. Like, it's pretty terrible business practice. I do like the fact that I don't think like AEW doesn't really do house shows, right? They just do like their TV tapings and
Right.
paper. I feel like that's a much more humane way to treat your talent, because I mean, wrestling is such a brutal profession, and these guys, I mean, they die young. It's a horrific way to make a living. But ultimately, no. I mean, I guess I should be ashamed to say it, but like, if the participants are willing, then I'll plunk my money down, and they certainly know enough, right? I mean, these guys know enough that they can make a living doing something else, but they love it. They love what they do, and they love to entertain. So I'm there for it. I mean, I watch boxing, I watch a little bit of UFC. I know how awful all this stuff is on the human body, and I'm still there. So I get why people might not, but yeah, I'm there, for better or worse. I'm there.
Yeah, I think the thing with AEW is that they are sort of independent contractors in the truest sense, that like they are able to work other promotions and have outside freedom, other than compared to WWE, where of course it has been exposed by many like a John Oliver's of the worlds, of like they are independent contractors, but they're practically employees in practice. And so I think that's the big difference there. But yeah, I think for the most part, I think except for the EVPs, probably like everyone is an independent contractor on AEW. But yeah, I guess it is sort of interesting. Like, how do you sort of do you often keep track of what's going on in the industry through like any sort of websites or anything like that? Like obviously, like our message boards or whatever of that sort.
Yeah. I mean, I again, like the YouTube algorithm strikes. Like
Right.
because I've watched so much stuff, I'm just constantly served up. Among some of the major, folks that do it. So I watch like, it finds me. So like I'll sit down at night and be flipping around YouTube because it's relaxing. And there's, what are some of the big ones, like What Culture Wrestling and all those Cultaholic and those guys, and some of the hosts are better than others, and but I enjoy, even if I'm not watching the shows themselves, I enjoy like just following the business or knowing what's going on. Like I was thinking recently, it's a similar relationship that I have to the show Saturday Night Live, which I mentioned, the wrestling, when wrestling would take over for. I've watched Saturday Night Live since pretty much not long after I started following wrestling. I got some from the 80s, right? And there were definitely stretches where I'm not watching it every week. I mean, maybe I catch some highlights on YouTube of a good sketch or something like that. But I'm always fascinated in like the mechanics, like the behind the scenes of Saturday Night Live. Like, I don't think I've watched much this season, but I'm always interested in following like who's the cast and who's out and who's in and all that kind of stuff, right? And I feel like wrestling's a very similar way, where like I may not be watching week to week, but I just find it interesting. I just think it's a really fascinating business. So I'll watch YouTube. I follow, some wrestling threads that Jesse's familiar with, I enjoy, I'm entertained by people discussing it. I think it's just kind of a cool business to interact with that way. So yeah. And like I said, and the difference now is that that content finds me. I don't have to go searching for it. So, in addition to all the other random nonsense I look at on YouTube, I watch wrestling stuff, so I'm pretty aware of like what's going on. I'm not like, an expert by any means, but I'm aware of it, which probably makes it easier for me to get dragged into like what I didn't buy an AEW pay-per-view, because I see people talking about it. I'm like, well, that sounds really interesting. So I'll plunk some money down and check it out. Right. Otherwise I wouldn't have, because I wouldn't have been reached. They're not really advertising it, so I wouldn't have seen that stuff.
Right, you're there waiting to be lured back into.
Yes.
Whether it's buying a pay-per-view event or maybe attending a live show that's in your area, or something like that. And I think that's really important, is that people will make the argument that like casual fans don't exist. which isn't true at all. I think what wasn't true is that casual fans cannot be pinned down into one monolithic block. I think what you're talking about is very similar to a lot of how other people's relationships with wrestling are, but obviously they're not going to all think the same, and they're going to be lured back in for kind of different reasons. I think it's really interesting what you said, like you were turned off by, like it was funny, like the Attitude Era didn't appeal to you really at all, when I think a lot of the conventional wisdom is like people were fans of wrestling, they became fans as children in the 80s, they stopped watching in like the early 90s or mid 90s because WWF was stupid, and they did things like make Tito Santana the Matador and all of these kind of things. Like all that's like exactly how people think of it. But you didn't come back to the Attitude Era for a variety of reasons. You were in college at the time. There was maybe some things you didn't like about it that much. That is very, I think, atypical of what a lot of people think about when they think of like, how did the casual fans progress? And then they age out of it again when they, turn into their 30s and they don't want to watch the Attitude Era anymore. And conventional wisdom was that WWE had to go like PG in the late 2000s and tone down their product because all the people that were teenagers and young adults in the Attitude Era had children, and they didn't want to bring their children to a wrestling show that was like this. And now I feel like they're kind of going backwards in a little bit, especially with how they handle their women in that sense. But it really is interesting, like kind of like what got you into it. I think it's really interesting that your son, like the Randy Orton Brock Lesnar match, that was his like breaking point where he's like, I'm done. And it seemed like it was like what a lot of people would think what turns off the same thing that turns off hardcore fans would be like unsatisfying matches and annoying like finishes, and not producing a story, not finishing a story or producing a story that people are interested in and seeing the outcome of.
100%. No, it's all about the story. I mean, it is, right? I mean, and clearly that was kind of, part of what was part of his breaking point. But I remember, it was a series of those things. Like, it just, I don't know, like, I get that you don't want to end every pay-per-view with the face being triumphant. Like, there's times that the heel's got to win and you got to build tension. Like, I get it. I mean, that's storytelling. But it became very clear that like WWE has this like perverse like enjoyment of like punishing its own fans, and I really don't get it. Like that's one thing I have seen about AEW where, and again, I'm not an expert, so there's probably a million exceptions to this that people could point out, but I feel like the times I've watched, it's like they like the crowd to go home happy. Like they would like, they have a big event, it's like, let's close on a high note, and everyone's like, yay, like, and let's send them home with a smile, right? And whereas there was a lot of times when my son and I were watching WWE, and so many of their major events just ended on this, like, why did that happen? Like, what's going on? And after a while, you're just like, you just don't value me as a fan. Like, and again, it would be one thing if it were part of a storytelling device that you knew was going to pay off. You had some faith in the product. Like, all right, this, it's like being a fan of the Patriots, and you're kind of like, all right, I don't understand last night's draft, but in Bill we trust. Like, I think it's going to pay off because he always does, right? If you had that belief, you'd go with it. But then they would fail constantly, right? You would, like, there was no payoff. The storyline would just fizzle out, or they would whatever. And then you're just like, and it took me it took my son not that long to figure out that's kind of how things would go a lot. So I think it was an accumulation where it was just like he just lost faith that this thing was going to pay off. And I do think, again, because I have the perspective of having watched it a million years ago, I am sympathetic, because I do think there's just so much time to fill these days for these companies. I mean, I just don't. It's unimaginable that they got to fill 5-6 hours of TV in a monthly pay-per-view. And again, I came from an era when there was like an hour or two a week and in a quarterly pay-per-view. So everything was just like a slow burn, and storylines could breathe, and I mean, it was a different era, so people had a little more patience for this stuff too. But like, it could pay off. Like you could sit with it, and now sometimes I don't know how they manage it, because like there's a million storylines going on at the same time, and it's complicated because guys get hurt, and sometimes you have to end stuff unexpectedly or whatever. So but I agree with that notion of just like I think you get burned out because there's just not a lot of faith. Again, like in any storytelling world, if I watch a Marvel movie and the ending is kind of like, oh, I don't know, I got a decade of being like, you know what, but they always bring it home. Like there's always the end of Avengers Endgame, and I'm gonna love this, so I'm gonna be with them. And I think with WWE sometimes, as a casual fan, what kind of would turn me and my son off was like, I don't have a lot of faith they're gonna pay this off for me, you know. And to me, it's all about the storylines, because sorry for rambling on this, but the other thing which strikes me is when I was a fan as a kid, for the most part, the in-ring wrestling was not good. Like, I mean, it was slow and plodding, and there was arm bars that would go on for like 5 minutes, and it was like sometimes the worst part of the product was like what actually happened in the match, you know, and you just kind of accepted it. But the storylines were great. I thought they were great, and they would pay off over years. Like, I mean, I have said this like out at a bar with people, and you've had a few and you end up talking about random stuff. I will randomly bring up, like, I think one of the greatest stories ever told is the whole arc of Hogan and Andre and their falling out, which ultimately all paid off like years later with like Hogan and Savage and the Mega Powers and all that. Like that was a continuous storyline that wove into each other over like 2.5 years. That was great. Like that was amazing storytelling along the way. That doesn't exist as far as I can tell. I don't see, as a casual fan, like any reason to think that there's going to be a 2-year epic storyline that I'm going to be able to invest myself in. Oh no, what is much better is the in-ring action is incredible. Like even mediocre matches are 10 times better than what I watched in like 1988, you know, like so it's just a weird juxtaposition that exists today. Like I think you take for granted the skill of these guys. And it's the storytelling that really needs a lot of work, I think. And I wouldn't begin to know why that is and what's involved in all of that is at the fandom I'm at, but it's apparent. It's very obvious to me. And it was apparent to my 11-year-old, which is really strange, you know? So.
Yeah, what you said is very, I would say fairly common. Like I remember Lance Storm, like he would go on when he was doing Wrestling Observer Lives or his own Wrestling Observer show, like he would mention how, you know, there are a lot of happy endings in WWE shows. And like, you know, like you said, like there'd always be some reason to screw over the fans and there would never be a resolution to that. And so I guess your thought process on that isn't uncommon, so to say, because yeah, I remember, you know, he would go on about that. And it is interesting how, like, you know, like it's a very simple formula, you know, give the fans what they want. And so like, but even then, like it seems like very difficult for at least WWE to figure that out. I'm also very curious, like, has your you say you've sort of like dabbled in and you watch like all the behind the scenes process, you watch all these YouTube videos, like has your son ever gotten back into wrestling ever since that Randy Orton incident, or is he just completely out?
I mean, not completely, but he's been largely out. Like I actually, when I got that pay-per-view, that the AEW pay-per-view a few months ago, it was a Sunday night.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know, do you want to come watch with me? And you know, part of this is because he's a teenager, and yet I don't want to do it. But like, no, he was playing video games in his room. And you know what? I shouldn't even say it. Last night we spent 3 hours watching the NFL draft together. So I mean, he would, you know, spend some time with his old man if he was interested enough. But he wasn't really into it, and I think it soured him on it. And much like what you guys experienced, I don't get the sense that there's anyone his age who's like really into it. You know, he doesn't mention it. It doesn't seem very mainstream. I don't even see, you know, I don't see kids wearing t-shirts like his age. He's 15 now. Like I don't see a lot of like the gear being worn. And I feel like that's a sign. It's just not part of his life. And he hasn't really seemed all that tempted to get back involved. as best I can tell. And maybe he will. I don't know. But right now, I'm a bigger fan than he is, which is a little funny given that it got me back in after 25 years. But
yeah, and it's going to be hard. I mean, part of it is when you're, is I think it's fairly natural, like for anyone, like you like something when you're a kid, especially when you become a teenager, you're like, I don't like that little kid stuff anymore. Like, it's not cool to mention that you like something that, you know, associated with your childhood, little kids. And then at some point you become, usually when you go to college, you suddenly are like, oh man, remember when I was a kid? Like, I want to, I started watching the iCarly reboot on Paramount Plus, and it was solely because like I like the show when I was a kid. Let me watch that. But if I was, you know, a teenager, I'd be like, I'm not watching that Nickelodeon, you know, stuff. And I think, I don't know if I'll come back around, but I do think the lack of, if you have a negative association with it, because you were burned out by it. Like when I went through a phase where I didn't watch wrestling, probably from when I was like 13 to 16. Like there were a couple years in the late 2000s that I just didn't watch it, and I just kind of got burned out. I had like kind of like your son, like I remember like the one big thing I remember really not liking was that like everything Rey Mysterio had to do was because of Eddie Guerrero. Like Eddie Guerrero, they were just like totally exploiting this guy's death, and before every match Rey Mysterio had to be like, I'm doing this for Eddie. And I was just like, as like even as like a 11 or 12-year-old, I was like, this is like really like dumb. Can't this guy win a match without mentioning his dead guy? Like it just felt cheap that they were trying to get him over. And I remember that isn't what took me away from wrestling. There were other aspects of it to it, but it was kind of what got me out of it. And then I got back into it because I started playing the video games again with one of my friends, and we're like, hey, you know, let's watch Raw. Let's just see. I bet you it's really dumb. And then I was like, it's become that. It's become this ever since. And anyone that knows me will know just how much of an absurd amount of time it occupies in my life. But it is interesting. I really wonder about the future when everyone talks about this 18 to 49, you know, the key demographic. What happens when the people who were, you know, fans in the Attitude Era age out of that demographic, and the people like your son's age are going to be expected to replace them, and you don't see any affinity for wrestling at that age, or really any of them. When your son was watching, were his friends watching at all?
A few, yeah. It wasn't widespread. It wasn't like when I was his similar age, where it was just pervasive. It was a few. Which also I think that's a problem too, right? Because again, like for when I was younger, because it got so mainstream, it like, you know, it builds on itself, right? Like if it's acceptable and all your friends are watching it, then it just kind of breeds more and more involvement. And if you kind of feel like you're a bit of an outlier and on an island and you only got a friend or two watching it, then it becomes kind of isolating, right? And I mean, it's easier to find communities and discuss it online than there ever was. But yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Jesse, like, as you got a little older too, if there's not a lot of kids into it, then then that stigma starts to grow, and then you're more apt to jump out of it if nothing's really gripping you. You know, if you're not just like, I love it too much. If you're kind of on the fence, then it's easier to fall out of it at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just goes back into what you're saying before, how there's just so much going on now, so much pop culture things to get into. And you even mentioned like there's 6 hours of television if just for WWE, but if you're also into AEW, then that's just like 9 hours of television, and then just more pay-per-views to watch. And it's a big commitment to be a wrestling fan if you like really wanted to get into it, if you're just getting into, you know, the top 2 companies in the US. And so like that probably plays a lot into it as well, just like the huge time commitment it takes to really get into wrestling.
Yeah. Yep. No, for sure. And I think, you know, you see it. You know, I work in media, and I so I get a little exposure to some of this stuff, and it's a problem with everything, right? Like it's a problem with, you know, I use this example without, again, I'll reference my son. Like he's a huge sports fan, huge sports fan, but he doesn't watch the games the way I watch the games as his father, like, you know, because he's got other things going on. But he can follow them. So like, you know, he can follow the NBA playoffs, but he has yet to sit down and watch a Celtics playoff game with me, even though I watched all 4 of them against the Nets. And like, he's playing video games. He'll see the highlights. He gets the highlight alerts like instantaneously. So I think he feels like he's engaged, but it's in a totally different way than I am, and he's just bombarded with stuff, as you guys are all aware of. So it's like it is hard to capture attention, and in a way, the WWE and AEW, like wrestling it is an old school model. It's not unlike sports where it's like you are demanding a lot of your fans. Like it's a 3-hour, whatever, 5-hour movie a week. It's a lot to ask of people. Yeah, in an era when, again, when I would watch it, it was one less time, and there just wasn't nearly as much going on. Like it was like what else was I gonna watch on Saturday morning at 10 in the morning? Like nothing. There was nothing on to watch, and I liked wrestling. Now there's everything. I can watch everything at 10 in the morning. I could, every show that's ever been made is on at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. Every album that's been released since like the 1950s is on at 10 in the morning, and video games. And it's just like, so it's like, it's a presentation of the product that's also a bit of an anachronism. Of course, what are you going to do? They make all their money from it, so you have to put all these hours on traditional television to make your money. But like, it's tough to engage kids because that's just not how things are consumed these days, right? So it's again, it's a real challenge.
Yeah, I want to ask you, just thinking about being a casual fan, and you have the WWE Network, so you're already kind of paying for it. I always thought now that they switched it to 2 nights, it's a little bit more attainable. But when they had WrestleMania and it's like this 7-hour show, I always thought, I'm like, WrestleMania is the kind of event that you're gonna get casual fans watching. They might not know anyone on the card, but it's like, oh, it's WrestleMania. Like, I know what WrestleMania is. It's a huge thing. It's a huge plus for WWE that they have this super identifiable event that people will just pay attention to, even if they don't watch a single shred of wrestling in between those 2 time periods. And I always thought it was really bad to have this like 7.5-hour show that's like really hard to watch because there's so much downtime in between acts and matches, and there's all these things. And I was like, if this is supposed to be for the casual fan, like, why would it be super long? That's like the opposite of how consumption generally would work, is that if you're trying to get something to get people more interested, you give them just a little taste and you make it. And I know it's WrestleMania, it has to be epic. It has to have matches, all have to have a lot of time, and it has to be this big spectacle. But I always thought it was so strange to me that like, this is not attainable for just someone coming out of the blue and be like, let me watch this, because it's just like, who has that amount of time it's going to spend that length of time to watch a wrestling show that they don't really care about that much ultimately.
Totally. It's funny you say that, because I was, so I was subjected to a couple of those while my son was into it, before they split it into 2 nights. And I remember one of them, we sat down here in the basement. There's a TV on the other side of this wall, and we fired the thing up at 5:30 or whatever that. I mean, it's insane. It's complete insanity. And me and my son and my daughter, who is 4 years older than my son, was interested in it. So we sat down and we enjoyed it. But it's a marathon, and by like 10 o'clock at night, you're exhausted by it. And I agreed. It was like there was a bunch of matches where you're just like, did this really need to be on this show? Like, I mean, I get it. Like, the wrestlers got to get paid, and there's storylines to pay off. And I guess I understood the logistics of it. The roster's like really huge, but like, yeah, as someone who was just kind of I just wanted to watch a WrestleMania, like 3 hours or even 4 hours is a lot more manageable than 7. And the other funny thing is, there was another year, I think that was the first year we watched it, having the network. The next year, we were on vacation down in Florida. My parents live in Florida, and we were visiting them the night of WrestleMania. It was a Sunday night, and I was like, oh, let me put the WWE app on your Roku, and I'll log in and we'll watch WrestleMania, because my son wanted to watch WrestleMania. So this is the funniest thing. So I sat there with him and my daughter, my wife, and their grandparents, sitting in their living room at their place in Florida, watching WrestleMania, right? So you could not ask for a more casual, non-existent fan experience than that.
Oh, you should have told WWE you're doing this. They'd be all over, like, multiple generations all sitting down and watching WrestleMania. It's their dream.
This is exactly it. This is what they live for.
Stephanie
right?
McMahon would have came right to your house.
Yep. So we sat down to watch it, and my dad got a huge kick out of it, because he remembered when I was my son's age watching this, and he had no time for it. But we watched it, and because we all had varying involvements of it, right? Some of it is just like, the wrestling on its face, it's kind of ridiculous, right? But it's entertaining, like, and so they would be like, well, this is crazy, but I'm enjoying it, and they got a huge kick out of it, and they liked it, but it went on and on. And at a certain point, you got to turn it off, because you can't watch it with your grandparents for 5 hours. Like, that's just not. It's not gonna happen. But you know what? It should be multi-generational. Like, the very first wrestling show that I ever went to, it was actually the only wrestling show I went to as a kid, until I took my son years later, was my grandfather took me to a show at the old Boston Garden randomly. He was just like, he called me up and said, do you want to go see wrestling show? And I was like, of course I do. That sounds like the coolest thing ever. I was like 10 years old. So we went to go see it, and it was a blast. And I was like, yeah, this is how like sports, if you want to consider wrestling sport, or at least entertainment, right? It's how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be handed down from like grandparents and parents to their kids. And that's how you build fandom. And that was like super cool. So they should crow about that. That's what they want, but not for a 7-hour show. No one should be subjected to that. It's way too much.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem that baseball is trying to figure out, right? Like you said, like baseball, like all sports, is a generational type of thing. But as the generations go on, the attention spans kind of shorten to where the kids can't really sit down to watch like a 5-hour baseball game anymore. And I guess wrestling sometimes can be that way too, where like, especially if kids aren't engaged as much as in practice they are. I mean, for WWE, like, they kind of think kids are engaged in the storylines, even though in practice they aren't really. But yeah, it is an interesting thing that, like, it is something that should be passed down to generations, and ideally the on screen talent should be the same as well. But it's like we mentioned before, it's sort of lagged behind that, where there aren't really a lot of younger stars out there, especially mostly for WWE. AEW, they've gone more ahead of that. They're working on building newer, younger stars, and so they already have a few already, and they're continuing to build up their roster with more younger talents compared to WWE.
Yep. No, I think building the stars is important. It's funny, like I would say, like, since I got into it a few years ago again, and I watch kind of casually now, arguably the coolest moment of like any wrestling show is the intro, right? It's the theme music hitting, and fireworks or lighting shows going off and everything. I mean, that's crazy entertaining. And it strikes me, again, particularly WWE, it's like they do a masterful job. I don't think anyone does a better like in-event presentation than WWE. I think most sporting events could take take lessons from the way that they just present their product, right? Like, it's top notch. And they make these people seem like such huge stars as they walk down the ramp to the ring, and then they ruin it with a lot of the ways that they tell stories, and then they look so weak when they crawl out of the ring after a loss or something like that. It always strikes me as being so stark. It's like the video packages they produce for WrestleMania and those events, like, really compelling. Like, you don't have to follow it for the year, like you guys were saying. You can stumble into it not having watched, and you can get the storyline in 3 minutes. Like, you can understand what's going on. They're a great production company. They do the intro, and there's music and everything, and then a lot of times it then falls apart. And then it's like, all right, well, I guess that person sucks. Like, I thought they were cool, and then now it's like it's just weird. It's weird the way way that their product takes like a hard turn sometimes with that kind of thing. But the ingredients are there. And in talking about like generational, this is what I was mentioning a while ago. Like, I feel like the window is there for all these promotions, because you got people like me and people even 10 years younger than me or more who were there for the Hulk Hogan era, who were there for the Stone Cold era. They're having kids. They were big fans. I think a lot of them would like nothing more than to experience that again with their kids. Like, like I said, it was a real thrill to watch some of this with my 10-year-old. Like, it was super fun. But that window will shut. Like, those people, like you're talking about, aren't going to be part of the demo like forever. And it's kind of a wasted opportunity. So I think a lot of these like lapsed casual fans, they're out there. And there's ways to bring them back in, because some of their kids are going to get into this again, but I don't know if sometimes it's sticky enough, and I think it all comes back to storytelling, because the athleticism is amazing. Like I'm constantly amazed by what I see what these guys do in the ring. I think they're absolute stars, and I mean it's incredible. But the stories don't always hold your interests the way the matches do, which is just a total reversal from what I grew up watching. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that colors some people's opinions with the idea is that casual fans don't care about matches. They only care about storylines. And look at when wrestling was popular, the matches were forgettable, but the storylines were excellent. I kind of think that's a misnomer. I don't think there's a reason why you can't have both.
Absolutely.
It would be interesting. And you also, and like the standard for what people think is cool and exciting is probably really different. Like people, if you were to compare the NBA today to the NBA of the 80s, right? There's obviously nostalgia for the NBA of the 80s, but the athleticism and stuff on display is much higher. The football, you could say the same thing, is that the players are faster and stronger than they were in the 80s. And baseball is actually a weird middle ground because the game was actually more athletic in the 80s than it is now for a variety of reasons. But for the most part, you're seeing just a better quality athleticism across all of sports.
Yeah.
And that's going to end up happening in wrestling. I want to wrap this up. I want to ask you, like, my kind of last question for you would be, what do you think would be like, if it, and it might be impossible for you in whatever your current life situation is, or just how you consume stuff. Do you think it's possible for you to become like a regular weekly viewer of wrestling, whether it's WWE, whether it's AEW, whether it's something else? Or do you just think the maximum you could do is maybe like watch pay-per-view and maybe follow along a little bit closer on social media? Do you think it's possible for you to actually become like a hardcore wrestling fan again? Or do you think that there's probably some sort of limit to how invested you can become?
Yeah, no, I think I could to at least some extent, right? I mean, certainly a lot more than I have been. Maybe not someone who could consume all, Jason, like you were saying, like, 12 hours a week of both promotions. That might be a stretch just because of life, but like absolutely a more regular viewer, more invested in it. Yeah, I mean, I think that the industry has that potential to rehook me because I love it. I've always loved wrestling. Like, I mean, I don't think I'm alone, right? So who wouldn't want to spend more time with something that you've loved since you were 9 years old, right? Like, I mean, I'm not turning my back on it. So I think the potential exists. I think they just got to make it a little more compelling. And it's easy for me to say because what I think is more compelling is not what the next person thinks is more compelling. But at the same time, it's scripted, so they can do anything they want, and they can make it vary. That's the great thing about it. You can have storylines that appeal to me and ones that don't. That's fine as long as they have some storylines that appeal to me. And they got to make it digestible. And I think that's part of it too, is like, if I'm not going to give it all 12 hours a week, and if I won't, but can you give me the 2 or 3 hours that maybe I am willing to invest and make me feel like I'm not missing out on stuff that, like, I could, make it not feel as overwhelming, that it's like, you can put in the time you want, because other sports are that way. I can watch, a regular season NBA game a week, but follow the other games and feel like I'm a big fan. And I feel like if they can tailor it that way, then sure. Then I'll get back and get the streaming networks. I mean, I spent $5 for Peacock to watch parts of the most recent WrestleMania, and I canceled it first thing Monday morning because I have no interest in anything else they do. But they did get me because it was an event, and it was fine.
It was WrestleMania. You had to watch WrestleMania.
That's it. It's a brand, and I'm old school. It was WrestleMania is the Super Bowl to me. It is a brand that resonates. So that there, yes. So to the question, absolutely, they could hook me back in to be some level of avid fan and get me spending more money and taking my family to things. They loved going to the house shows. They thought it was a blast, and my wife and daughter thought it was a blast going to the house show. They loved it. and so they would sit and they would watch some of this stuff with me and placate me because they enjoy it too. But it feels very overwhelming right now that like I got to jump in and consume everything to know what the hell's going on, and it feels like, you know, I'm gonna have to wade through a lot of garbage to get there. So I think they just have to, you know, just improve the product a bit, you know, to get me there. So, but there's hope. There's definitely hope they could do it. I mean, wrestling is like a cockroach, man. It just exists. It has existed for what, like 100-something years. I mean, it'll continue to exist. It absolutely will. But I think they just got to evolve with it.
All right, well, excellent. I really want to thank Dave for coming on and being an excellent guest and being so enthusiastic about this. I really, like I said, I really don't know Dave at all.
Now we know each other quite well.
Yes.
We've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, I just like I knew from the message, you know, the message boards we go on. There's a pro wrestling thread, and I post a lot in it, and there's some other people that post a lot in it. And Dave kind of pops in and out sometimes, just talking about like, you know, I saw this, I saw that, like. And I'll never turn down an opportunity. I love talking to people who aren't as into wrestling as I am, but have an interest, because I think that perspective is really valuable, which is one of the reasons I want to do this. But I just sent you a direct message, and I was like, hey, like, I do this podcast, like, do you want to come on and just talk about your wrestling fandom? And I think this has been better than I expected as far as the kind of content that we've gotten out of it. Just like you talking about your fandom and some of your perspectives, I think has been really valuable. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. Jason, thank you as always for joining us. And for all the people who have been listening or watching each week, we thank you as well. And we'll be back again in a few weeks.